Brand. Welcome to the session, The Framing of Evidence and Argument. It's wonderful to see such a great turnout on a Sunday for the Parkland conference. We have two speakers today, David Cournoyer and Roberta Laurie. We're going to start with Roberta Laurie. Roberta is a recent graduate of the MA in Environmental Education and Communication at Royal Roads University, where she wrote her thesis on the framing of ethical oil. She teaches in the Bachelor of Communication Studies program at MacEwan University and is currently writing her second book, which is titled Touching This Storied Land, Navigating the Narratives and Debate that Surround the Alberta Oil Sands. So the title of Roberta's talk is The Framing of Ethical Oil. Over to you.
Great. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'd like to begin by telling you a short story. A few years ago, I was visiting family in BC. We somehow got onto the subject of the oil sands. I was probably on one of my rants, I have to admit, when my aunt made a comment. She said, "But the oil sands are ethical." She followed this with something about Saudi Arabia's repressive regime, and in that moment I was filled with such overwhelming anger and frustration that I was speechless, which doesn't often happen to me. I had nothing to say. I stewed about that conversation for many months afterwards, trying to unpack my emotions. I admire, love, and respect my aunt and felt betrayed by her words. On that topic, I felt as if I'd been personally attacked. Of course I hadn't been. She hadn't meant the attack personally on me at all. But something about my inability to come up with a compelling and convincing argument against the development of the oil sands left me feeling impotent in the face of something that seemed very important to me. If I couldn't convince my own aunt that the development of the oil sands was wrong, then who could I convince? And that's why I'm speaking to you today. It seemed to me that one of the keys to my problem was understanding the right-wing rhetoric. Today I'll pass on a few of those things that I've learned. My research on the framing of the Alberta oil sands began with ethical oil, so that's where I'm going to start today. In his book, Ethical Oil, The Case for Canada's Oil Sands, conservative political pundit Ezra Levant claims, Canadian oil sands oil is the most ethical oil in the world. Now, Levant has been characterized as Canada's Rottweiler by some, and dismissed as a right-wing gadfly by others. But there can be little doubt that his prolific promotion of ethical oil has helped shape the discourse surrounding the Alberta oil sands, at least in my opinion. Jonathan Kay of the National Post writes, on the subject of ethical oil, Levant has almost single-handedly tipped the terms of debate against the environmentalists. Not long after the release of his book, of Levant's book, Canada's then Environment Minister, Peter Kent, said, oil from the Alberta oil sands is ethical oil. He went on to say it is regulated oil and it's secure oil in a world where many of the free world's oil sources are somewhat less secure. I should give you some context about framing. Some of you might recognize this gentleman. This is George Lakoff. He's written extensively on the use of framing, particularly within the U.S. political system. He says, frames are mental structures that shape the way we see the world. Although most frames are subconscious, every word is defined by mental frames. So essentially, frames are the associations that we make between words and ideas. So, pairing the word ethical with the word oil is genius in a sense. When we hear the word ethical, we think good. We think morally responsible. We think doing the right thing. It's a very Canadian word. By putting the words ethical and oil together, we begin to associate the two, and in the end it becomes a juggernaut of a frame. Although it seems that industry and government have backed off somewhat on the use of the actual term ethical oil, as recently as June of this year, on a visit to Washington, International Trade Minister Ed Fast was quoted as saying, "Our oil sands represent a sustainable, ethical, and responsible source of oil for the United States." Fast went on to compare Canadian oil sands oil to that of Venezuela, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia. Now, use of the designation ethical oil may have waned somewhat, but it has not gone away, and many of the frames in which Levant wraps his ethical argument have stuck and continue to resonate with Canadians. I'll call the frame most associated with Levant's book the we versus they theme. Levant spends much of his book criticizing non-Canadian oil producers. For example, he points to Saudi Arabia. He says, women can't even have elective surgery without their master's consent. And he explains that the country exports jihad around the world. Some of you might recognize this ad. This was put out by ethicaloil.org. Ethicaloil.org began as a blog that set out to promote Levant's book. It's morphed into something a little bit different now, and the funding behind ethicaloil.org is somewhat mysterious. It now seems to be trying to keep the idea of ethical oil alive, and it has produced quite a number of these pro-oil sands ads. They're not very subtle. I find this one interesting because it refers to women in Saudi Arabia, and yet, maybe I'm wrong, but that woman doesn't look very Saudi Arabian to me. So other oil-producing countries are described as medieval, torture-loving, and fascist. Levant claims that Venezuela's Aboriginals are a favorite whipping boy of the government. Compare that to Canada, one of the most hospitable places in the world to live. As Levant builds his argument, he compiles insults and criticisms upon Canada's competitors through the use of sweeping generalizations and common stereotypes. With a grand flourish, he concludes, "Every drop of oil from Alberta is one less drop from some fascist theocracy or some brutal warlord, one less cent into the treasuries of Russia's secret police and Al-Qaeda's murderers." Stephen Harper has also echoed Levant's message. Canada is a very ethical society and a safe source for the United States in comparison to other sources of energy. It's a clever argument in its own way. Why discuss improvements to our own oil and gas industry when we can talk about repressive regimes and environmental negligence a half a world away? Levant's argument is a morally relativistic one. Now, some of you may know Alberta author Geo Takich. He wrote the book, Will the Real Alberta Please Stand Up? And he's a friend of mine. He teaches at Grant MacEwan. I appreciated his no-nonsense anthology that he used to describe the ethical oil argument. He said this, "So if you kill 10 people and I only kill 5, according to Levant's argument, I'm more ethical than you." And I think that pretty much sums it up. But Levant doesn't just attack other oil-producing countries. He attacks many groups who are opposed to oil sands extraction, or aren't even necessarily opposed to the extraction, but simply propose their responsible development. He characterizes Greenpeace as unethical televangelists milking their congregants, and even suggests that environmentalists in Saudi Arabia are in cahoots by describing them as a loose coalition and claiming they have a brilliant symbiosis. And Levant doesn't just attack environmentalists. In his book, he heaps ridicule on then Beaver Lake Cree Chief Al Lehman for opposing development. He criticizes Chief Lehman, or past Chief Lehman, as presiding over a petty kingdom and suggests that the benefits from oil sands development are a threat to his personal power. The Pembina Institute also comes under Levant's scrutiny. Although he doesn't offer the reader proof or even specific names, Levant claims the Institute is in league with foreign lobby groups. When criticizing a Pembina press release in which the research group projects the loss of more than 160 million boreal forest birds to development, Levant imagines Dr. Evil raising his pinky while saying the word million, and likens the Institute's research methodology to that of Dr. Doolittle. Levant's creative cultural reference and metaphor may not be fact-based, but it is belittling and is meant to detract from the Pembina Institute's credibility as a nonpartisan research organization. Throughout Levant's book, there is an accumulation of this sort of derision and sarcasm that frames oil sands critics of all types as, at best, bumbling, misinformed innocents, and at worst, self-interested manipulators. Levant makes it clear that since Canadian oil sands oil development is ethical, anyone who opposes the unrestrained development of the oil sands, and this could include ENGOs, Aboriginal groups, research institutes, concerned Canadian citizens, they're all unethical. He concludes his argument by saying it would be unethical to oppose an industry for selfish purposes when it benefits so many people. As I mentioned before, many of Levant's messages have stuck. Last year, while discussing the proposed Northern Gateway pipeline, Natural Resources Minister Joe Oliver publicly claimed that radical groups were trying to block trade and undermine Canada's economy. Now, this kind of messaging is problematic. As many of you know, an Access to Information request recently uncovered documents showing that the RCMP and CCIS have identified extremist environmental groups and Aboriginal protesters as a potential source of domestic terrorism, thereby justifying the monitoring and infiltration of such groups. It's become commonplace, certainly here in Alberta, to hear environmentalists referred to as eco-terrorists, radicals, and extremists. The Canadian public has been primed with this message, and I find that very troubling. I've spoken to many people about the ethical oil frame. Dr. Jennifer Good of Brock University was struck by the power of the have your cake and eat it too message that Levant has crafted. She calls this framing of ethical oil both fascinating and at times breathtaking. And she believes that we are seeing the end games of oil. Now, I want to share this lovely character with you. I just heard about this guy. Maybe some of you already know about him. This is Alex Epstein. Has anybody heard of Alex Epstein? No? Okay, well, I'm not quite sure how long he's been around, but he kind of scares me. He's from California, but he's actively soliciting the business of oil and gas companies here in Alberta. I heard about him from a friend who's a communications specialist for an Alberta-based oil and gas company, and she heard him speak at an industry-sponsored conference. Now, this conference was put on particularly for industry PR specialists and communicators. So he's speaking directly to the communicators who represent Alberta and Canadian oil and gas companies. She told me that many of her colleagues were very excited by his message. Epstein brands himself as an energy expert and sells his services to North American oil and gas companies as a speaker, trainer, and consultant. And rumor has it that he makes a lot of money doing it. He's written several books, which I haven't read yet, and a manifesto, which I have. As you can see, he promotes a very anthropocentric message. I pulled this quote from a debate he had with Bill McKibben not too long ago. "We need to perfect the planet for human life," he says. So if you're interested, you can find Epstein's manifesto on the internet. Just Google the title, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels and Epstein, and it'll come up for you. You can download it as a PDF. In his manifesto, he explains that the fossil fuel industry must take the moral high ground. There's only one way to defeat the environmentalist moral case against fossil fuels: refute its central ideas that fossil fuels destroy the planet. He makes the case that fossil fuels make the planet dramatically safer and dramatically richer in resources. Now keep in mind that he is speaking directly to industry PR specialists. And here's one last quote that I'd like to share with you. "Nature," Epstein says, "gives us very little in the way of useful resources. From clean water to plentiful food to useful medicines, we need to create them using ingenuity." Now, something that Judy Garber said yesterday really resonated and stuck with me. It made an impression. She said, "Words, narratives, and truths are contestable." Now, I believe that when these words speak mistruths, it's our responsibility to contest them. Ultimately, Levat and Epstein are able to use language to promote the oil and gas industry and the ongoing use of fossil fuels. But their colorful messaging and flamboyant rhetoric acts as a distraction. Where we need open and honest debate, they give us a business-as-usual message that appeals to emotion and self-interest, but completely fails to address Canada's oil sands challenges. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Roberta. So our second speaker is Dave Cournoyer. Dave is a writer and political observer based here in Edmonton. He currently works as a communications advisor with the United Nurses of Alberta and is publisher of the political blog titled, it's hard to say, daveberta.ca. daveberta.ca.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's more. In 2012, the global public relations company Hill Knowlton recognized Dave as one of Alberta's most influential tweeters. His interests include provincial politics in Alberta and the study of the conservative movement in Canada. Over to you.
Thank you. First, thank you very much, everybody, for coming this morning. I'll give a little bit of an apology beforehand. I have a bad cold, so my throat is a little sore, so please bear with me, and hopefully this will go very smooth. The presentation that I'm about to give is a shorter version of a presentation that I made earlier this year at the Canadian Association of Labour Media conference. It was actually held here at the University of Alberta. And you can also check out my blog, daveberta.ca, for previous blog posts that I've written about this topic. And this presentation might spur me to write another blog post about this exact topic. I'm just going to turn on my timer just to make sure I'm within the limits. And here we go. So today I'm going to talk about the apparatus of conservative groups that make politicians like Stephen Harper possible, make him able to become, or help him able to become Prime Minister, and how together they effectively deliver their message. These groups have helped create a political environment where conservative politicians can thrive. This is a network of astroturf groups, employer organizations, and market fundamentalist think tanks that help push the conservative agenda in the media and the public debate. And I guess before I continue going on, I really want to stress that I don't think this is a conspiracy. I know there's conspiracy theories out there about, you know, political groups and front groups and AstroTurf groups. I don't believe this is a conspiracy. I think this is a concerted effort, and it's right in front of us. It's right in front of us. Here's some of the groups. They are focused, they're determined, and they're dangerously effective at their jobs. And unlike the political left, they are unemotional in their actions and their responses. Most of these organizations exist for the sole purpose of pushing their agenda and populating the media and the internet with their messages, which are lower taxes, anti-union, pro-privatized education, pro-privatized healthcare, anti-government, essentially free market everything is when it comes down to it. In Alberta's recent municipal election, we witnessed conservative special interest groups pop up around the province. In education, a group of former Wild Rose Party candidates have created the Parents for Education Choice group, which advocates for charter schools and homeschools. And in cities across Alberta, we saw official conservative slates emerge. Team Airdrie in the city of Airdrie, Red Deer First in Red Deer, and anonymous groups like St. Albert Think Tank in St. Albert. You will recognize many of the groups listed on this slide, and while it is a long list, there's actually a considerably small group of conservative activists working behind them. It's not uncommon for a spokesperson or an employee of one of them, say the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, to all of a sudden become a spokesperson or employee of another, say Sun News Network. And while political progressives have groups like the Parkland Institute, the Public Interest Alberta, Friends of Medicare in Alberta, and the Broadband Institute and the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in Ottawa, we don't really have anything, or progressives don't really have anything, that rivals this web of conservative groups. So let's take a look at some of them. You'll recognize this gentleman. Founded in 1967, the National Citizens Coalition was run by Stephen Harper from 1998 until 2002, when he returned to federal politics. Mr. Harper's current chief of staff, Ray Novak, worked with him here at the National Citizens Coalition and followed him back when he returned back to federal politics in 2002. While the NCC is much less influential than it has been in previous years, the group has adopted a Tea Party-flavored attitude, praising American politicians like Ron Paul and Rand Paul, attacking the Canadian labor movement, and promoting Sun television. Probably the most effective of the groups listed in the web are the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. It's inspired by the Americans for Tax Fairness, founded by influential conservative lobbyist Grover Norquist in the United States. And the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is very effective at media stunts, and its spokespeople have become a reliable source for catchy quotes, which helps makes it one of the most high-profile groups that I'll talk about today. They're also really good at what they do. Their sole purpose is to push an anti-government agenda in Canada, and one of the ways they do that is, one of the tactics they use is through freedom of information requests, and you'll notice quite a bit of Canadian Taxpayer Federation media coverage that has to do around freedom of information requests that they release afterwards. But as my colleague David Klimenhaga wrote on his blog, daveberta.ca, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is not a federation of Canadian taxpayers. According to its own constitution, the group only has around 7 members. So this is an example of an AstroTurf group. We talk about grassroots groups, we talk about AstroTurf. While the Canadian Taxpayers Federation consistently calls for government transparency, the identities of its own financial backers and own financial supporters remains a secret. The Canadian Taxpayers Federation is not transparent, it is not open, and it is not accountable. The group also has strong ties to Mr. Harper's Conservatives. Federal Conservative Cabinet Minister Jason Kenney was the Canadian Taxpayers Federation Alberta Director before entering federal politics in 1997. And the group's current Atlantic Canada Director, Kevin Lacey, worked in the Prime Minister's office before entering his current role, and its Ontario Director was formerly Jason Kenney's press secretary. She also worked for Danielle Smith, interned with the Fraser Institute, and previously worked for the Sun News Network. Launched in 2011, the Sun News Network, also known as Fox News North, describes itself as unapologetically patriotic and less politically correct than other TV networks, and how? The network's controversial hosts, Brian Lilly, Ezra Levant, Michael Coren, and Krista Erickson, who are probably more accurately described as entertainers, make sport of attacking elitists like David Suzuki and the liberal media. While Sun News Network gives a platform, Sun News Network gives a platform for Sun newspaper columnists, right-wing groups like the ones I previously mentioned, the National Citizens Coalition, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and the Manning Centre, and conservative politicians like Pierre Poilievre, Jason Kenney, and Toronto's notorious Ford brothers. And as Roberta mentioned in the presentation she just presented, Ezra Levant has also used the platform to talk a lot about ethical oil and attacking some of the science behind climate change and the oil sands. Sun News Network's vice president, Corey Tenake, worked as Mr. Harper's director of communications and has been the company's key spokesperson in its bid to gain a mandatory carriage fee that would place it as a Category 1 channel, requiring all cable providers to offer the channel. So potentially coming to a television near you, the Sun News Network. The Fraser Institute. We all know who they are. The Fraser Institute is a well-known market fundamentalist think tank in Canada. With a libertarian focus, the nonpartisan Fraser Institute has called for the abolishment of minimum wage and has been viciously anti-union. Its stature and longevity has helped make their reports newsworthy, and its reports are frequently reported as unbiased in the media. One of the interesting strategies that is apparently used by the Fraser Institute is to send out media releases, embargoed copies of media releases and reports to reporters, and use that pressure to not give reporters time to gather responses from other sources in order to balance out an article. So a lot of times you'll read news reports that report on Fraser Institute reports, and they won't have comments or quotes from people who would dispute that claim because the reporters simply just did not have enough time. Also interestingly, Wild Rose leader Danielle Smith was an intern for the Fraser Institute. Two employer organizations, the Merit Contractors Association and the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, have been central players in the push for Bill C-377. For those of you who are familiar with it, Bill C-377 is a private member's bill that was introduced by a conservative backbencher in the House of Commons. And it's a piece of federal legislation that would force unions to disclose their financial records to a level not required by any other corporation or any employer. So these two groups have lobbied hard in Ottawa and lobbied hard in public messages for legislative changes that would limit the ability of labor unions to publicly advocate on behalf of their members. So you can check out one of their websites. The Merit Contractors launched uniontransparency.ca, and you can get a real idea of what, they're not really talking about they're not trying to create an environment where unions are actually more transparent. They're trying to put unions and union shops at a disadvantage in terms of competing in the oil sands, in terms of competing in industry. Also interestingly, Wild Rose leader Danielle Smith was the Alberta director of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business until 2009 when she entered provincial politics. Founded by the godfather of Canada's modern conservative movement, Preston Manning's Centre for Democracy was created in order to train a new generation of right-wing candidates, activists, and campaign managers. The Manning Centre also sponsors a $10,000 annual contest where participants submit ideas for projects to advance the conservative movement in Canada. One recent winner of the $10,000 prize was a website called bluecrowd.ca, and you can check this out. It's a really neat idea, actually. It's a crowdfunding website that allows conservative groups to post videos and it helps them. It's a platform for fundraising for conservative groups. So I had the opportunity to attend the Manning Centre's networking conference in Ottawa earlier this year. And I have to say it was a fascinating conference. First of all, it was probably one of no offense to Parkland, it was because I think the Manning Centre has a giant budget, a huge budget. It was probably one of the best organized conferences that I've ever been to. They pulled out all the stops, and it was very fancy. But it was also interesting because you got to see the whole conservative coalition there. The whole, I mean, when you talk about conservatives, there's not just one type of conservative. There's this whole kind of constituent groups of conservatives that make up the coalition that helps people that has helped people like Stephen Harper become prime minister. So you could identify, the social conservatives. You could identify the libertarians. You could identify the kind of business conservatives that aren't really interested in the kind of ideological politics, but they're supporting a business angle. And then you can notice all the people who are there who would probably be liberals if the Liberal Party formed government. I call them the good time Charlies. The Manning Centre also has connections to what I like to call the sprawl cabal. And those of you from Calgary will remember this. Captured on video this summer, a group of wealthy developers in Calgary were exposed in a plot to stack City Council with anti-Nenshi candidates. The video suggested that 10 wealthy Calgarians had donated $10,000 each to the Manning Centre's Municipal Governance Initiative, which is currently run by one of Prime Minister Harper's former advisors. But the root of modern day conservative political thought in Canada is found in the Calgary School. So a core group of conservative academics at the University of Calgary Political Science Department who have been driving the conservative agenda in Canada. Who would have thought that a group of tenured professors employed at a public university who are collecting a public salary and will collect a public sector pension are driving the anti-government agenda in Canada? Calgary School academics like Tom Flanagan, Barry Cooper, Ted Morton, and Rainier Knopp have helped reshape Canadian politics through their lectures, their seminars, their publications, their public advocacy, and probably most effectively through their students. Graduates of the Calgary School include Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Sun News entertainer Ezra Levant, Wild Rose Party leader Danielle Smith, Federal Cabinet Minister Pierre Poilievre, Conservative strategist Ken Busenkal, Fraser Institute Director Mike Milkey, and former Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Ian Brody. So you can see these are people who have really moved into strong positions in the conservative movement. So now there's the big question, what do progressives do about it? Well, they can choose to support groups that present opposing messages, but these groups that I mentioned need to be challenged on other levels. Progressives can challenge their integrity, expose their connections to each other. Like right now today, I've given you a short presentation about something that I could literally talk about for hours. So this is kind of just a brief overview of the connections that I see in the conservative movement. But challenge their public comments, draw the connections to each other, and challenge their ideas. Ezra Levant was recently publicly shamed for racist remarks he made about the Roma people. Tom Flanagan, as we all know, was temporarily shunned by his conservative colleagues for comments he made about child pornography while speaking in Lethbridge. He's now back inside the conservative fold after a short shunning, having presented a session about campaign strategy at the Manning Centre during the recent Conservative Party convention in Calgary. Expose their financial backers. Who are they? Who's bankrolling these organizations? Expose their bias. Groups like the Fraser Institute are not really nonpartisan. Are they? Challenge their charity status. Are groups like the Fraser Institute non-political? Challenge their transparency. Who funds groups like the Canadian Taxpayers Federation? Who gives them their marching orders? In conclusion, I don't like to describe this as a conspiracy. As I said before, it is a concerted effort by the conservative movement to reshape politics and reshape the narrative of government in Canada. And progressives should pay attention and learn because these groups are highly effective. Don't dismiss these groups because you simply disagree with them, because progressives have a lot to learn. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dave and Roberta. Wonderful talks. In light of what you've both been discussing, it's terrific that we have a good chunk of time now for some collective discussion and Q&A. So in the spirit as well of diversity, I would ask that people keep their questions or comments relatively brief so that we can get as many different speakers as possible. So we'll have the Q&A, and this will be followed by a couple of brief Parkland announcements. We have 2 mics, and you can identify yourselves by hands and Rich, I apologize that I didn't mean your hand up first. Yes. Sure. At the front.
Sorry,
and then after these three speakers, perhaps there are some women speakers as well that we'll go to.
Okay, question for Dave. Yeah, great presentation, both of you. So you had that great slide of the web of all these right-wing groups, Fraser Institute, Sun News, CD Howe, etc. So you said they were highly effective. You named a few progressive groups, but you said the progressive groups just aren't as effective right now as the right-wing ones you mentioned. I guess the question would be, how did the progressive groups get as effective as the right-wing counterparts without turning into slime balls like the right-wing ones are?
Yeah, can you hear me? That is a good question. And I think that is something that is, I mean, politics is a dirty game sometimes. It's a tough game. And these groups have proven that they will go they'll take it the extra mile to get their message put through. I think a lot of it is simply their consistency. I mean, some of these groups have been working on their messages for 20 years, for 30 years. And I just don't, I mean, I think there are a lot of progressive groups who have been very effective, but I think not as effective as some of these right-wing groups. And as I said, I think it's a concerted effort between these groups in order to push a conservative, free market, anti-government, whatever agenda in Canada. And honestly, I think that one of the big advantages that they have is that they have been around, they have been doing this for quite some time, and that they are absolutely relentless. I think one of the advantages that some of these groups have, I mean, especially when you're dealing, I mean, I look at it in the frame of the labor movement, dealing with or competing with these groups in the public narrative. I mean, groups like the Canadian Taxpayers Federation exist solely to push these messages and to push these agenda. Groups like labor unions exist to, do a number of things. They have a huge responsibility towards membership services, a huge responsibility towards other things as well as trying to compete. So I think that's one of the advantages that these groups have, is that some of them exist solely for it. That's their entire purpose, is to push a political message.
Dave, thank you for the shout out on the CFIB.
This is David Clemenhaga, by the way.
I just wanted to say, it's really a point of information, and I might just have misheard you, but I thought you said that the 10 donors to the Sprawl Cabal donated $10,000 each, but in fact they donated $110,000 each. And so that's an important differential. I may have just misheard Dave, but it's an important number, because what it means is that really overnight they raised $1.1 million for a highly political effort. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question for Roberta. You nicely described how ethical all has been framed in the media, etc., etc. How would you now answer your aunt?
Well, I think that I would begin by telling her that, or explaining to her that people like Ezra Levant do have an underlying set of worldviews and values that maybe aren't consistent with her own. A lot of times we accept these messages because we've heard them so often, and we don't question them. We don't question them within our own framework, our own family framework. And, my aunt in particular, she has grandchildren, and she has nieces and nephews that she loves. And I know that she wants them to grow up in a world where they can thrive and, drink clean water and breathe clean air. And I don't think that is the same world that Ezra Levant and people like him envision.
I can also ask the speakers identify themselves.
Hi. I thought maybe when Stephen Harper got his majority, it would be his downfall because he would go so extreme. And to me, he is going very extreme, Muslim scientist, not caring about the environment at all, just everything to the economy. When you go to these conservative type events, are there any dissenting conservatives? You know, talk about reasonable stuff.
There definitely, I mean, there definitely are, you know, reasonable conservatives. I mean, one of the conservatives I bumped into, one of the people who had attended attending the Manning conference, actually got up and spoke in favor of public health care because he had experienced it. He was, I think, he was originally from Poland. He'd immigrated here to Canada, and he'd seen the challenges that the healthcare system in Poland had faced when, I think he was explaining when the Iron Curtain had fallen and private healthcare was introduced, and then there was this huge mix and it didn't work. So he, absolutely, I think absolutely, there are always dissenters. I mean, there's some who think that Stephen Harper is too extreme. There's some that think he isn't extreme enough, and we definitely saw that. There's definitely constituent groups inside the Conservative coalition who believe that Stephen Harper hasn't been strong enough on whether it's social conservative issues, whether it's market issues. I mean, I think the thing about, you have to understand, I think that the Conservatives realize this, and I think Stephen Harper realizes this, is that you have to keep your coalition together, but you also have to win votes of Canadians. And I would argue that most Canadians find themselves in somewhat the moderate middle of most issues. And I think the Conservatives are smart enough to realize that. I mean, they built this over 3 or 4 elections. They were able to win a majority government, and they're very politically savvy. They're very smart, and they shouldn't be underestimated. I mean, I think that might be one of Stephen Harper's greatest strengths, is that he's constantly underestimated by the political left in this country. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have a Conservative majority government in Ottawa right now.
Can I address that as well?
Sure.
Yeah. I do know a number of people, communication specialists within the oil and gas industry, and I know I was talking about Alex Epstein earlier, and how his message seemed to resonate with a lot of communications people within the industry. But I also know that there are a lot of people within the industry who actively question the policies, the PR messages that are coming out of the oil and gas industry, and who really do have a more middle-of-the-road approach or a more middle-of-the-road philosophy. And so I don't know, I think, as Dave said, I think that there are a lot of moderates, and you have to those are the people that maybe it's a bit easier to reach, those moderate voices. They get overpowered sometimes by the radical voices out there.
Thank you.
My name is Meena Srivastava. I think it's both a question and a comment, and I was just thinking as I was hearing about the strategies, the communication strategies of the Conservative Party and its huge web of whatever it lies. It's not just coming out of nowhere. We know that corporations in particular have had almost a century to develop their tools of understanding human behavior and translating that into something that created consumer culture. And now that corporation and state is sort of merging into one in one sense, in the conservative context. I think that's where it's coming from as well. So we are living in an era of sound bites. When we keep making arguments that are always very complex and should be complex, but they're getting lost in this kind of field, in this context where everything is about sound bites. People have no attention span. They don't want to listen to any of these arguments. So I think this is an important reminder for us as well. Like you said rightly, the progressives have to learn a lot. And this is an important reminder that see what's happening with Rob Ford, for instance. Why is it that the Ford Nation is still prepared to vote for him? Because almost every conservative who spoke about it or was forced to speak about it mentioned taxes, mentioned his perceived efficiency in keeping the taxes low. So they know what works, which is why they still manage to even have people who are sort of middle of the path in that movement. So it's not a question, probably just a comment and a rant.
Okay, thank you. Just 3 quick points. First of all, I think we need to be very careful when we talk about conservatives. The progressive conservatives are very different from the extreme right to which Harper has pulled them. And I think that's a very different agenda in my experience of the Canadian landscape. Sorry, I should introduce myself. Colin Soskolny. I'm Professor Emeritus in Public Health Sciences at the University of Alberta. I think it's also important to look beyond Canada at examples. We think of the coke industries in Texas and the incredible billions of dollars that they invest in right-wing think tanks and the unbelievable harms that these sociopaths, in my view, diagnosable sociopaths, actually are causing to the planet. And I think we need to reflect on how they behave in relation to how we in Canada are responding to that. And just as an anecdote, having been sort of the face of AIDS in the early 1980s out of Toronto when I first moved to Canada and worked out of the University of Toronto, it was fascinating doing media work with community support groups. I was the scientific voice on television, and it was intriguing to see just how organized the right wing is. The extreme right religious fanatics were writing letters on heavy-weighted stationery, and this gives new meaning to the notion of the weight of evidence. Apparently, government weighs for the people in favor of changing or informing the public about how they might prevent HIV, as opposed to the weight of evidence from people coming in who would write off perhaps on lighter stationery. So this is just how insanely orchestrated, how brilliantly insanely orchestrated these people are. So I just bring those practical notions to the table. Thank you.
Can I just address that a bit? You know, I don't know that we can match dollar for dollar the right wing's bottomless pockets. I don't think that's ever going to happen. So we have to be a little bit more creative. Something that really struck me this past couple of weeks, especially watching the shenanigans of Rob Ford, which I hate to even say his name now, it's become so cliche. You know, we seem to be very accepting of these bullies. Really, these people, so many of these people in the right wing, they are bullies. You know, you look at a guy like Ezra Levant, look at a guy like Don Chaney, which, you know, a generation of hockey fans has idolized. He's nothing but a big bully. Well, you know, this seems to be a sort of a cultural trend, but bullies can't exist unless there are bystanders. And so we need to challenge, you know, the acceptance of this kind of messaging, and we each have to challenge this kind of messaging. And maybe, you know, we don't have the money that the right wing has, but we have ourselves, and maybe that's the best we can do.
Okay, we have a lot of people who are really anxious to speak, so we won't do and get the man behind the camera. So we have we'll take comments and questions in terms of 3 right now.
Super. My name is Christopher McMillan, and I'm going to admit right up front that some of the highlights of my political life, active life, has been the mentions that I've gotten on your blog, Dave. But my question is, it's about the internationalization of the progressive movement. Corporations are international, they're multinational, they're all around the world. You talked about how we can look to the conservative movement in Canada to model ourselves off of in terms of making connections. So my question is, are there international examples of progressives getting together and doing the kind of things that we're talking about we need to do? Are there groups out there that are spanning across nations, spanning around the world, that are working towards these kind of connections that you want to do? I know 100 years ago, the socialist movement, the left movement was very international. It was cross nations, and war destroyed that. But ultimately, I'd like to know if there are examples out there of other countries where this has happened, and progressives have learned these lessons, and if we can take lessons from other successful progressives around the world.
I guess I'm not familiar with other countries. Refer to the internet? I'm sure they do exist, and I sincerely hope that other movements do exist, but I'm not familiar with them.
I think that in Canada, a lot of environmental groups are banding together. You know, we've seen with Idle No More and Greenpeace and the Council of Canadians and several other organizations that are coordinating some of their efforts now, which is really quite encouraging.
Okay, thank you for that. Is it my turn? Yes, I appreciate you both. I appreciate the comment about bullying, particularly living in Alberta for the last decade or two. But you mentioned the Sun Media being a platform, which is quite true, but I'm also concerned about the CBC getting to be a similar platform. I once told the CBC that if you insist on using the Fraser Institute, would you at least tell your listeners who funds them? But, you know, I think we need to know that the CBC have good supporters, and we need to know, and they need to know that they do have. But that we want more than just two pundits up there giving their views. We want some facts and figures and statistics, the kind of thing we've heard here at Parkland over this weekend. Secondly, there's another name you could add to your list, Dave, is John Carpe. And he has a thing called, he had it called the Canadian Federation for Constitution something. He's got a new name now. Received charity status. And as I told Tom Walkham from the Star, I have a little problem with a former head of the Canadian Taxpayers Association getting tax subsidies to now sue Canadian taxpayers. He's taking patients and suing the Canadian Medicare system. He's got one involved in Alberta at the present time, I think in Calgary. And that needs to be exposed because a subsidy is a subsidy. And receiving charity status, unlimited. I've contacted the federal government, and there's no limit to how many people can give to a certain charity in a year. So we don't know how much we're subsidizing in these places. But thank you.
Hi there, my name is Thulasi, over here on the right. Chris Hedges is a very prominent critic of the so-called liberal media, like the CBC in Canada, New York Times in the States, maybe the Globe and Mail, for, if not being completely complicit in sending the same messages as the conservative web, but certainly contributing to the fragmentation of our web, the progressive web, and dissipating our message. So how do we reclaim our progressive media?
Good question.
I mean, I think you raised a good point about the liberal media. I mean, there's this kind of the myth of the liberal media. The Sun, groups like the Sun News Network like to use it because they've created, they like to attack elites, right? Because the liberal media, you assume there's reporters drinking champagne in downtown Toronto. I mean, it's important to remember that a lot of the liberal media that some of these conservative groups attacked are also, you know, newspapers whose editorial boards endorsed Stephen Harper's Conservatives in recent elections. So it's not really, I think there's a real myth around the liberal media. I think that in terms of reclaiming it or claiming it, or just simply, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with more actively participating in it. It's challenging. Every time a newspaper or television network reports on a Fraser Institute report and doesn't provide a balance to that news report, I think you have to go out and challenge that. You have to call the reporter. You have to contact the editor. You know, if you're an organization who's opposed to or would provide a different alternative viewpoint than the Fraser Institute, you have to get out there and hound the reporters. You know, they may ignore you, they may not print a response right the first time, but it's consistent enough, and you become a reliable source, like the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is. That, you know, they will keep on coming back. They will keep coming back. They will keep coming back to you. But I mean, I think we do see this. I mean, groups like the Parkland Institute and groups like Public Interest Alberta and Friends of Medicare are, you know, they get media coverage, but I don't think it's the same kind of. The Fraser Institute and the Taxpayers Federation have kind of inserted themselves in this kind of unique position I think, as spokespeople in the way the media is reported and in our political dialogue.
Okay, so the next is, again, lots of research. So the next thing is to do walk 100%. Sure.
My turn. First, a suggestion for Roberta. You could try telling your aunt that oil doesn't have ethics, people have ethics. And you may or may not wish to acknowledge the National Rifle Association. My comment, or possibly question, is that we have at present in Ottawa a situation where the Conservatives seem to have overreached severely. I think it was the CIA who used the phrase plausible deniability, which meant protecting the boss from having to admit anything serious in public. What the Prime Minister's office seems to have done now is developed an implausible deniability, which has put their boss on the spot. And I think that could mean that the right wing is eventually going to collapse under its own weight. We can wish.
Yeah, my name is David Lott. One of the concerns I have, having attended these conferences for many years, is that left tends to be reactionary, as opposed to proactive. And you see at this conference, people talk about the resistance and fighting against. Even Kevin Taft fell into that trap yesterday at the end of his talk, which he usually doesn't do. And so, being more proactive, and also the other thing is being more inclusive, trying to reach out as much as possible and having inclusive messaging. Well, for example, I realize pacifists like to think of us as being a peacekeeping country, but that's not our history. Our history is that we have done what's necessary to help the world, and that sometimes that was going to war. And having a more inclusive message that results in us suggesting we ought to be a peacekeeping country that's leading the change on climate change, because that's what's necessary now, whereas in 1939 it was a different story. And acknowledging that and trying to bring into coalition other people. The stupid slogan, people before profits, for public Medicare, small business people think that profits are a good thing. They probably aren't. And what we actually want is we want to have an efficient, effective, and equitable healthcare system. It's a better, strikes me as a better slogan. Talking about decreasing crime statistics as a reason for not being so concerned about crime. Well, that doesn't cut it with the person who's been a victim of crime. And really, it's diagnosis of the situation. The question is, do you want to have safety or do you want to have retribution? Do we want to have our political financing determined by the vote or the wallet? And about Ezra Levant, the people who should be most ticked off about Ezra Levant are those people who own oil, like us. Because every time he opens this big trap and talks about ethical oil, it makes it more difficult for us to sell our oil at the highest price, because of the kickback from the people in our social license to operate. So there's all sorts of opportunities if we would be smarter about being smarter, more inclusive, and more proactive about what we're doing, put forward what we want as opposed to what we're against.
I just want to very quickly say that I'm sitting here with one vote meeting, because it's very ethical in this one. The man here, you. Hello. I just want to say I have two knees, and one knee is wounded in the most recent election campaign in Edmonton. My question is about left or right. I find Edmonton, you know, looking at mayors all over Canada, quite a challenge. There's a big difference. And recently I went to Toronto and said that I had in my suitcase a new mayor for them, and they were very happy welcoming me. But here, what happened in Edmonton, I just wanted to ask you, I think specifically, Dave, you said that the progressives, we are not good enough, we are not fighting back. And, you know, coming from a country where progressives fight back a lot in the Netherlands, I just wanted to ask you a question, specifically what happened in the election campaign for Don Ives. That's where I got my wounded knee. I worked hard for him, and I felt very good, and I suddenly thought, hey, what's the difference between left and right? Because it's sometimes confusing to explain that to the people in my street, and also it's confusing when you follow the news. For instance, I was always doing coins, columns, right in the garbage. I mean, I'm not going to waste my time. And recently, he was invited to Edmonton, he at the University of Alberta. He spoke to a very good audience, and I gave him a compliment. I said, I never listened to you, and now I go to the door when your article comes out. On that day, he wrote an article against Harper, which was very good. So my question is, we need very clear road signs. We need to know sometimes left or right. And whom do we invite to forums, and whom do we invite? Sometimes by inviting an extreme right winger. Ezra Van was invited to Edmonton Lit Fest a few years ago and just about killed me. So anyhow, the question is that left or right stuff is very important. How do we get that message across? With whom are we going to still associate? And what do you think did happen in terms of left and right collaboration in the recent election campaign in Edmonton? I want to know, did I waste my right knee?
Okay, so I can I hop in here? Okay. I guess there's two things to say about what's your question. In terms of the left, in terms of being effective, three things I jotted down right away. I think progressives tend to be too nice sometimes. I think progressives debate amongst each other sometimes too much, sometimes to our disadvantage, and that we can't make a decision. And it makes us look weak. And sometimes progressives are too emotional, and they can't divorce emotion from their actual message or their actual the goal of what they want. It's too emotional. I guess in terms of Don Iveson's election, I was also involved in Don Iveson's campaign, as I recognize a number of people in this room. I guess my comment with that is that municipal politics creates odd bedfellows. I don't think Don Iveson's campaign was a left-wing campaign. I think municipal politics is a little different, and you need to create a big tent in order to win in municipal politics. So I think that's what Don Ivison did. I think, number one, I think he was the best candidate in the race, but I think he was able to create a team of people from progressives on the left to conservatives on the right, from the whole spectrum, who were able to coalesce around his campaign. I think that was one of the successes of that campaign.
I'd like to address that gentleman.
Sure.
Okay. I'd just like to address that gentleman's comments over there. You know, I think that the right-wing pundits in the Conservative government, they do send a very divisive message. And I think that they do this purposely. Sending such a divisive message derails communication, it derails dialogue, and so there's nothing to talk about anymore. I do feel that as left-wing, politically active individuals, we should be more proactive. I completely agree with your statement. I think that we should be more inclusive with our messaging as well. You know, I think on the subject of the oil sands, there are a lot of things that the right wing and the left wing can agree on. You know, and this is what we should maybe be focusing on, in my opinion at least. You know, we should be focusing on increasing oil revenues, oil royalties. Perhaps we can redirect those increases to R&D on sustainable energy. You know, we should be doing more upgrading in province. That creates jobs. You know, those kinds of messages resonate with the right wing as much as they do with the left wing. And so why aren't we trying to focus on those kinds of more positive messages rather than, you know, this idea of butting heads all the time. So I think that, you know, we should be more active in that way.
So now we're going to walk again. Is there anybody who is having that effort to see reduction and repair that?
I'd like to thank you for passing the baton to me. My name is Jay Smith. I want to come back to Roberta and your emphasis on framing. Yet on the other hand, the title of your current book and the next book is The Oil Sands. And what time in this province you could use tar sands and oil sands legitimately. They were part of discourse. The government decided that they were not going to permit within the public service the use of oil sands. And you can trace the tar sands, you can trace the drop-off in the legislature, you can trace the drop-off across the mass media in this country. So it became, to use tar sands, you were an outlier, you were a protester, you were a dissident. But if you notice, Thomas Clayton Mueller, he associates himself, his organizations, with the tar sands. Indigenous people use the terms tar sands. Environmental use the word tar sands. Even in the United States, New York Times uses it, and prominent politicians use it, and throughout Europe, it's tar sands. So why did you choose oil sands? You could have chosen perhaps a neutral term, bitumen, but most people don't know what the hell that is. But when you had the choice between the two, you chose oil. I'd like to know why.
Yeah, that's fine.
I would like to know what we can learn in lessons of cooperation from these right-wing groups. I think that's made a huge difference to their power, the connecting between the unifying of the Reform Party and the PCs, and on the progressive side seems to be so fractured. I would like to know what lessons we can learn so that we can be more effective in opposition to them.
Hello? Yeah. Hi, my name is Kevin Reed. I really want to applaud the suggestion the gentleman over here pointed out that one of the things that progressives have to do, in fact, is try not to just be reactive. However, if you try to tell that to the conservatives, note how their attack ads seem to be so successful. We do have to try to, by virtue of being proactive, we have to postulate some workable solutions. And of course, we're going to be talking to people that won't believe the science, because that's their credo. Now, the debate here seems to start about why are progressives impotent and why is the other side so powerful? Well, obviously it's money, but there are really a lot of black boxes involved that don't get attention. In the first place, it doesn't take a little giant to figure out that big oil services, big pharma, big HMOs, big insurance, big banks, and big construction need only put a very small percentage of their humongous profits into the coffers of the PC party, and you're going to have a 1,000-year right automatically because they can buy it. Now, the question comes about, are they really smarter than us? Well, no, but they've certainly got the money to buy the help, and that's where a lot of people don't see the black box. Joyce Nielsen, Nielsen, about 20 years ago, this book called The Sultans of Sleaze. She's from Simon Fraser, and it dealt with the big PR firms like Burson Marsteller or Hill Knowlton, whose websites say that they manufacture consent. And yesterday, Kevin Taft mentioned how the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, CAP, produces an awful lot of very expensive television ads, you know, the pristine environmental scenes, with the suggestion maybe they've got something to do with it, or when they don't. Why am I saying all this? Is that I think we really have to look at some of these black boxes like the hiring of the PR giants to run things. The Hill Knowlton was preceded all those television ads. And there's another thing that goes on in Alberta, run by CAP, or suggested and planned by CAP, and I bet you most people here never heard of it. It's Synergy Alberta. You should look it up on the internet. Question? Who said that? Somebody that's got a Valium deficiency? No. In fact, I did have a question. One thing that struck me about all of these groups that Dave had on the board, so many of them, when I checked a few years ago, have charitable status. And I once attended a section in the Chamber of Commerce that explained how companies who give to charity can actually make money. I don't know how it works, but here we have Fraser Institute with charitable status, and I don't know how they can keep that if their mandate is specifically proselytized. And but they have it. Dave, how many actually have charitable status?
Really, apologies to all of the people who want to ask the question. This conversation will certainly continue. We only have 3 minutes. I want our speakers to have a chance, approximately 1 minute to respond to these fascinating questions, and then there are a couple of brief Parkland announcements and conclusions. Yeah. And those of you who are burning to get into this conversation, please, it can flow after this session.
Well, I was wondering who would ask me why I chose to use the term oil sands. Seemed inevitable. Well, here's the thing. When I first started playing with this topic and doing some research, I exclusively called it tar sands. And what I found when I started talking to people about it, you know, even people out of province, even people who were highly educated, as soon as the word tar sands came out of my mouth, that's all we debated, was why are you using the term tar sands? That makes you an environmentalist radical. And so I clung to it for quite some time, and then I thought to myself, you know, I'm not doing myself any favors. One of the primary rules in communication is know your audience. You know, if I'm going to speak to a certain audience, then I'm going to take the conversation to them. I'm not going to stand on my mountaintop and yell tar sands. I'm quite happy to give on that one little point and make a better argument for more important things.
I guess on the charitable, I'll just quickly go through 2 points. On the charitable status, then groups like the Fraser Institute, I mean, I think the thing that citizens can do, the Canadians can do, is challenge their status to Revenue Canada, write a letter to Revenue Canada asking them to investigate. On another question about what we can learn, what progressives can learn from the Conservative movement, I think one of the big ones is that they've made, part of creating these groups is they've made a concerted effort to foster their young activists in these positions. A lot of these organizations operate as a training ground for young Conservatives where they can cut their teeth. Stephen Harper, Danielle Smith, Jason Kenney, these people, these politicians who are very successful politicians, conservative politicians, they cut their teeth, they learned the tools of the trade while running these organizations. And I think that's one of the things that progressive groups can really need to learn is to foster young progressive activists and help train them in order to move into politics and move into other positions.
Okay, great. So just a couple of brief announcements I'd like to make. So a reminder to everybody that most of the conference has been live streamed, and the video and audio will be archived on our conference website immediately following the end of the conference today. So drop by at parklandinstitute.ca and follow the multimedia tab at the top of the page. There you will also find some of the media files from the past 2 Parkland conferences that you can download and listen to. While at the website, of course, remember to check out the Parkland blog, where Parkland staff and research associates regularly post timely commentary and analysis on the issues of the day. So if you happen to be a social media person, make sure you follow Parkland Institute on Twitter and like Parkland on Facebook. Events like this conference, these talks, the conversations that will emerge out of them are very, very important, perhaps particularly in Alberta. If you'd like to see events like this continue in the future, I'd encourage everybody to become a sponsor member of the Parkland Institute if you'd like. Parkland membership is by donation. This means, for instance, that if you give a monthly contribution of $10 a month, you are considered a sponsoring member and can receive hard copies on request of Parkland reports. To support the programming and research work that the Parkland does, drop off your completed pledge form at the Parkland table. You will also receive a charitable receipt for your donation in the mail. Please remember to complete the conference evaluation at the end as well. The forms are included in your conference package. And last but not least, I want to thank everybody for being here, for the wonderful questions. It was a shame that everybody didn't get a chance to ask theirs, but again, encourage the conversation to continue. Please join me in thanking our speakers.